Hello, and thank you for taking the time to view this makeup video for Theology 131. The subject matter of this video will be the module on masturbation, which we did not have opportunity to discuss in class a few weeks back. As a reminder, the reading corresponding to this module is The Pastoral Problem of Masturbation by Father John Harvey. You may also find it interesting to read David French's very short article, America's Real Porn Problem. We have touched upon some of the contents here in this module already, dealing with, for example, the moral analysis of external sins against the Sixth Commandment, as well as some incidental remarks on pornography and on artificial reproductive technologies. The content of this lecture will be testable on the Unit 2 test following the Holy Week vacation. We begin the module with some definitions, as usual. We note that many definitions of masturbation exist, and these highlight different aspects of the phenomenon. Not any of these are perfect definitions. Each could be improved in some way and gives only a partial understanding, so it is important to consider the different aspects implied in each of the definitions. Before that, however, I should offer a brief etymology. Masturbation derives from two Latin words, manus, meaning the hand, and turbatio, to stir up or to excite. So it is by manual stimulation that people most often masturbate. This does not exclude, however, the use of foreign objects, such as we may discuss further on in the lecture videos. A first definition can be found in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It doesn't reference the means by which stimulation occurs, but it says, by masturbation is understood the deliberate stimulation of the genital organs in order to derive sexual pleasure. That is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2352. At first glance, this appears to be a serviceable definition. However, there are some problems with it. It invites the question of whether deliberate stimulation of the genital organs for non-pleasure-seeking finalities still qualifies as masturbation. And of course we can think of some people who do engage in masturbatory activity without seeking to derive sexual pleasure. So, for example, those acting in pornographic films are more interested in a paycheck than in sensuality. Or further, men undergoing fertility testing or engaging in artificial reproductive technologies such as in vitro fertilization or artificial insemination still masturbate. But whether they get their jollies is a secondary consideration to their principal goal of assessing the state of their health or of conceiving a child by alternative means. Or in the case of sperm donation, it may again be done in service to a paycheck. A second definition is more classical. This is from the textbook on moral theology written by two authors, both Belgian, Ertnes and Damen. The edition I have in my possession is from the mid-20th century and is already a 14th edition of the book. Here, the behavior is referred to as pollution. It is described as being the voluntary effusion of semen without copulation. A very adequate definition if we're only speaking about male masturbation. Now, the terminology is archaic, and as a comment on this definition states, it's understood to include both the pre-ejaculate as well as vaginal fluids. A third definition, the deliberate use of the sexual faculty outside normal conjugal relations. This is found in the document Persona Humana, which is one of the readings given for the course. Note, this document, written by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1975, wasn't so much describing masturbation itself as stating a general principle. Recalling the definition of normal conjugal relations we had given earlier in the course, namely, completed, penetrative, vaginal intercourse between spouses, this states that whatever goes against that particular sexual practice essentially contradicts the finality or the end for which our sexual faculty exists. By implication, masturbation, which is not a form of normal conjugal relations, contradicts the unitive and generative purposes for which our sexuality exists. So, this definition, once again, is a statement of principle, which can be useful in judging what behaviors are moral and what behaviors are immoral. I had already said in each of the sections about the 6 species of lust, identified by St. Thomas Aquinas in the second part of the Summa Theologiae, question 154. In some sections, I may have described them as 7 species. It's because St. Thomas Aquinas treats a couple of them somewhat separately, but still as grouped under a different heading. Okay. These 6 species of lust are 6 different ways of externally violating the 6th commandment. I remind students, first, it is possible to violate the 6th commandment internally, by way of lustful thoughts. Where we are talking about external activity, however, these include simple fornication, adultery, rape, incest, seduction, and the 6th category, the unnatural vice. Under the unnatural vice, an attack is made directly on the generative aspect of our sexuality, the part we have in common with animals. The preceding 5 types don't directly attack generativity, but do directly attack the unitive purpose, which is particular to us as humans. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century, argues that non-generative forms of sexual activity between Christian spouses represent a graver sin than other types of sexual immorality, such as, for example, prostitution. St. Augustine substantiates this position by noting that sexual activity outside of marriage, such as prostitution, can still result in the begetting of offspring, whereas Christian spouses who have oral or anal intercourse with one another are incapable of generating new life, something which even animals seem to understand at an instinctual level is a purpose toward which our sexuality is ordered. The unnatural vice includes a number of other sexual sins. Not only practices such as oral and anal intercourse, but other forms of masturbation, bestiality, as well as homosexuality. We need to give a psychological analysis of masturbation in order to understand its moral dimensions. We begin by asking why people masturbate. Psychological research, as well as the physical sciences, can also give us some important insights. They aid our moral reflection and are useful as tools for that reflection. You may look at Gaudium et Spes paragraphs 44, 45, and 52 to see a statement about the Church's positive estimation of how the sciences can contribute to the Church's proper work of making moral assessments and pronouncements. I note, however, as is noted in Persona Humana paragraph 9, that the empirical sciences are not a substitute for moral reflection, and that what is statistically common, or perhaps practiced in other cultures, is not ipso facto correct, nor is it ipso facto moral simply for those people in their own context. that would be to give in to an undue sort of relativism which holds that there are no objective moral standards, and by extension, no objective human nature, to be affirmed or disaffirmed by certain types of external conduct. If I were to put this all into one pithy little phrase, I'd say science has got the first word in the matter, but theology will have the last word. Science provides data for us to reflect upon, but the actual reflecting is properly the province of theology. This is for methodological reasons which prevent the empirical sciences from judging the rightness or wrongness of things, forasmuch as their methodology limits them only to describing facts. That's a good and a worthy thing, but we do have to recognize what limits it has. Now, coming back to the question itself. People masturbate for various reasons. In younger children or adolescents, self-exploration is a prominent reason. Young children developing into adolescence and gaining a sense of themselves as sexual beings realize that, well, when a certain region of the body is stimulated, or when they entertain a particular thought or view a particular image, it excites a pleasurable feeling in themselves. And of course, even young children, even animals in fact, are able to associate the presentation of a stimulus with a pleasurable result. So, to try and reclaim this pleasurable sensation, they might engage in the practice of touching themselves or otherwise stimulating themselves in order to excite that feeling. I'm sure it will come as a surprise to no one, but sexual pleasure is pleasurable, and the stimulation of the genital organs or the having of sexualized thoughts can be a form of escapism or stress relief for some people. We can also speak of masturbation as somehow ancillary to sexual activity. Experimenting with different types of pornography, for example, is how people develop a better knowledge of their kinks or what turns them on. Also, some couples use it in the context of their sexual relations in order to excite them further during the performance of the sexual act itself. We can speak of it as an alternative to sexual activity. Now, time was that when I was growing up, my classmates and I would always tease each other by saying, "Haha, you're a masturbator." I'm willing to bet that students are still doing that nowadays. Maybe not as much as in small-town USA, but chances are you've heard that. And even if you haven't heard it, the inference to be drawn there is that masturbation, while an alternative to having a girlfriend or a boyfriend as the case might be, is not really an acceptable long-term alternative. We place a greater value on interpersonal relationships than on the simple obtaining of pleasure through whatever means. We can also speak of non-pleasure-seeking finalities for which people masturbate, and I'd already mentioned a few of these: those involved in the production of pornography, those undergoing fertility testing, and those undergoing artificial reproductive technologies such as artificial insemination or in vitro fertilization. We should say a word about masturbation and affective pathologies, and this will have something to do with what we say later on, dealing with the subject of pornography. We can look at masturbation as a cause of affective pathologies, that is to say, disorders in the way one cares about or relates to other people. Masturbation can produce a negative influence on these patterns of caring and relating. It lends to narcissism, for example, or self-absorption. it can tend to promote an objectifying view of other people, wherein they are merely stimuli for one to behold or to enjoy, mere means of exciting sexual pleasure in oneself. We can also talk about certain habits associated with pornography use, and it is in this connection that I do recommend reading David French's article. Case in point, we all know what Control-Shift-N does on our web browsers, on Google. It's not for the guys who are secretly ordering bouquets of flower and boxes of chocolate for their girlfriends. It's for porn. Now, very few people, very, very few people, in fact, are open about their habits of pornography use or masturbation. That's why a feature like the Incognito tab exists. The existence of this feature abets people in putting up a duplicitous facade. It abets people in being secretive, in being furtive, in hiding this aspect of their personality from other people, who might have an expectation of fidelity from them. We can examine the long-term psychological consequences of this. As David French notes in his article, it teaches young people to sneak around, to be dishonest, to hide things. And those are not positive traits in any society that values honesty. In addition to this disposition to be secretive or duplicitous, we can also talk about negative consequences for relationships. As I shall say a little bit further on, excessive or habitual use of pornography can result in a type of conditioning. What I mean by that is the presentation of a particular stimulus in the form of certain images, plot elements, what have you, prepares a person to respond to sexual stimulation only in a certain way. I'm generally quite dismissive of romance columns, but if you go on Rappler these days, you should be able to find their advice column entitled Two-Pronged, where they've got a couple of different experts giving different perspectives on what people write in about. Now, one of the things that they're commenting on in the most recent one that I've seen is a man who has difficulties achieving climax and ejaculating when he has sex with his girlfriend. And he notes, as an aside, it's only when I have sex with my girlfriend that I have trouble ejaculating. But when I use pornography, I can come right away. The long-term effects of porn use can decrease the quality of one's sexual intimacy. For example, by accustoming a person to achieve climax only in one particular way or when presented with one particular stimulus. Quite apart from this very practical side, we can talk about ways that pornography use or masturbation affects other aspects of a personality. There's the need for instant gratification, which arises from pornography use and masturbation. There's a sort of a inability to defer gratification and to insist on having one's needs met immediately. And if this seems a bit absurd or perhaps, old-fashioned of me, do consider the wide varieties of pornography that are out there and how easily they may be obtained. It really takes absolutely no effort to get whatever type of sexual imagery one wants, using the expedient of the internet. We can also look at masturbation, as well as pornography use, as the effect of affective pathologies that are already there. That is to say, certain disorders in the way one cares about or relates to other people can dispose that person to the practice of masturbation. Not only can masturbation cause a certain narcissism or lack of impulse control, but if those pathologies are already present, masturbation becomes an easier practice. We should also note, somewhat more sympathetically, that a habit of masturbation can be symptomatic of psychological trauma, such as, for example, a person who has genophobia. That is defined as the irrational or pathological fear of sexual intercourse, and is often associated with rape trauma. For some people, women especially, penetrative intercourse evokes the trauma of rape that they may have experienced. And consequently, to engage in that sort of intercourse is to relive the traumatic experience of rape, and it may be easier, psychologically speaking, for that person to engage in a practice of masturbation in order to have a greater degree of control over the sexual experience, and not to feel, for example, in a position of vulnerability, or to awaken these associative memories. We can also talk about another phobia, gymnophobia, or the irrational pathological fear of being seen naked. And you could imagine that a person who's bashful about his or her body, or a person who has been brought up to think of sex as disgusting or dirty, would have a very difficult time engaging in activity with another person. Solo activity may be preferable, psychologically speaking, for that person. We do have to talk a bit about the neuropsychology of sexual arousal. And this is one of my favorite parts of this module, because I usually get to pick on life science and health science majors. But we're doing this by video, and so I'm very sad as a result. But I'll still show you the stuff. Sexual arousal causes changes in our neurological chemistry. Here we see two molecules, metencephaline on the left and morphine on the right. The red elements connected by the dotted line show you the structural similarity of metencephaline and morphine. Metencephaline is an endorphin. The word endorphin derives from the prefix endo, meaning endogenous, and orphin, the suffix there, referring to morphines. Endorphins are endogenous morphines, or opioid compounds that our body naturally produces, as opposed to exogenous morphines, such as one might find in heroin, in hashish, or other chemicals of that sort. Endorphins inhibit pain and induce euphoria. Anyone who's done long-distance running may have heard of an expression called the runner's high. Thinking back to my high school when I would run cross-country, a 5-kilometer race, there I'd be, running the course, and I'd feel a lot of pains and aches in my legs. I'd feel a heaviness of lactic buildup from all of the training we'd done before and the lack of oxygenation. But I'd run for maybe a mile or two, and all of a sudden I couldn't stop from having this big dopey grin across my face, and suddenly the pain would fade away. Physical activity caused the release of endorphins within my brain, inhibiting my pain and inducing that feeling of euphoria. This also occurs in another form of sustained cardiovascular exercise called sexual intercourse. Wow, look at that. You know, I've actually seen this pattern on t-shirts before. That's oxytocin, the snuggling hormone. Like endorphins, it also inhibits pain, but further induces feelings of calm and of security. Importantly, it also plays a role in social bonding. When a mother breastfeeds her child, stimulation of her nipple by the child's suckling causes the release of oxytocin. And in fact, shortly after childbirth, the release of oxytocin can be so strong that it causes adverse results in the mother, for example, feelings of dizziness. Should also note, oxytocin is released during childbirth as well, and is thought to have some role in getting the mother to recognize and to care for her child. Now bear in mind, at a social level we understand this, we do it consciously now, but in the case of animals, oxytocin may cause this maternal bonding in a reflexive and an unconscious way. Anyhow, returning to the subject of sexual arousal, oxytocin is also released, for example, by genital stimulation or stimulation of the erogenous zones, and it causes the partners to bond as well, which is why couples like to snuggle and cuddle after sex. I could say a word on prolactin, which promotes relaxation, but that's not a necessary point. Here's something further. Dopamine. Dopamine is important in the formation of associative memories, the linking of various stimuli with the pleasurable or the painful results that follow from them. Associative memories, by the way, are some of the more important memories that we form. They have an important evolutionary function. Certain things, such as very bitter foods, tend to create a strong impression on our mind, because those bitter compounds are often associated with poisonous things. Likewise, sweet or good-tasting things tend to also trigger associative memories and get us go back and eat these high-calorie or nourishing foods which promote our survival. Likewise, sexual activity, I've told you before, and you certainly don't need me to tell you, is pleasurable. And sexual activity ordinarily promotes the survival of the species by the transmission of genetic data. Consequently, we have developed an evolutionary response whereby we associate the pleasure of sexual intercourse with the act generative of that pleasure, and as a result we are incentivized to go and engage in sexual activity and to transmit our genes. We can also talk about changes in neural activity that occur when one is sexually aroused. Higher order functions tend to decrease, whereas lower order functions, those associated with the more primitive parts of the brain, tend to increase. Okay? Basic takeaway point, it's hard to think clearly when one is sexually aroused. Hence, some of the bad decision-making people make. Now, of course, I've said this already. It doesn't bear much repeating, but I'd just like to put it in one different way for your consideration. Sexual generativity is like the ulam. Sexual pleasure is like the gravy. From an evolutionary perspective, the main raison d'etre of our sexual activity is passing along genetic material. Any pleasure we derive from that is incidental, secondary, not the main attraction. Okay? I'd like to say further that lower order creatures are bound by their instincts. I've told you before about Mau Mau the cat and what she does when she's in heat. Mau Mau can't control herself, she's pure id. But we, however, are capable of many more things than Mau Mau the cat. Of course, we can act on our instincts just as she would, but we're also capable of suppressing our instincts and practicing continence, which is a willed or conscious decision not to engage in sexual activity. We're also capable of subverting our instincts and engaging in masturbatory behavior, wherein we seek the sexual pleasure associated with the performance of the sexual act, but without actually engaging in that sexual act in a natural or generative way. So returning to the example of ulam and gravy, you know there are people, you've seen them at Jollibee, you've seen them at Kentucky Fried Chicken, they'll order a little tiny viand, a mountain of rice, and they will drown it in gravy. They're seeking the gravy for its sake. They're not after what's really nourishing so much as they're after what's pleasant tasting or what's filling. And we recognize that, we diners, as a disorder. That's not the right emphasis to be making. Likewise, if one tries to obtain sexual pleasure without engaging in the sexual act itself, all other things being equal, we observe a disorder in that type of sexual activity. Okay? Now, a point I'd already mentioned and will say again, sexual pleasure contributes to the formation of habits. And consequently, forming a habit of masturbation is not difficult. We associate the pleasure with the performance of some act, whether normal conjugal relations or a different type of stimulation, either with the hand or with some other device. We know that doing this thing produces the pleasure. And for the reasons I described about neurochemistry of sexual arousal and changes in neural activity, it's very easy to develop a habit. It's not so easy to break the habit, and indeed a high possibility of recidivism is there, simply because biology works against us in a certain way. I'd like to put things in a theological perspective now. And here we find a text from Genesis chapter 38, verses 6 through 10. This is often cited in substantiation of the Christian condemnation of masturbation. Here we see the biblical figure Judah, who arranges a marriage for his firstborn son, Er. Er is married to a woman named Tamar. But Er was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and consequently met with death. Then Judah said to his second eldest son, Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he would spill his semen on the ground when he went to have sexual relations with the wife of his brother, so that the children of his brother's wife would not be conceived in the first place, and consequently not reckoned as offsprings of his deceased brother. This was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and Onan also met with death. As I said, it's often cited against masturbation, but if we step back from it, it seems to be referring to something else, what's known as levirate marriage. You may read about this in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verses 5 through 6, in which a practice is enjoined upon Israel by its God and Lord. If an elder brother dies without having begotten children, in order to carry along the family line, his eldest surviving relative is then to marry that man's widow and beget children, who, as we saw in Genesis chapter 38, verses 6 through 10, would be reckoned as children not of their biological father, but of that deceased person. We can think of it as a kind of etiology. I had told you before what an etiology is, namely an explanation of how a practice came to be. The book of Deuteronomy describes Israel at the time of its exodus from Egypt, and while it was sojourning in the desert before entering the promised land. A practice was enjoined on Israel in that book of Deuteronomy. Of course, if people were to ask how the practice came to be, one could point back to the text of Genesis 38, 6 through 10, and say, here, we are doing what our ancestors have done for years and years. Okay? Now, the practice of onanism is distinct from masturbation. In old-timey sources, you might see onanism as a stand-in for the word masturbation, and nowadays it's regarded as a more polite way of saying it. But in fact, the practice refers to what's called coitus interruptus, what you may know as the pull-out method. It is a contraceptive technique, as we see very clearly from the book of Genesis, chapter 38, 6 through 10. It has parallels with another technique called amplexus reservatus. Amplexus reservatus was proposed in the 1930s as a possible birth control technique for Roman Catholics to use. Whereas coitus interruptus involves pulling out of the vagina at or immediately before the moment of climax. Amplexus reservatus involves stopping just short of climax in order to avoid ejaculation. Both are laughably ineffective ways of avoiding conception. Firstly, because the pre-ejaculate contains semen, and secondly, because it's not that easy for a person to exercise conscious control over his or her actions at that moment of climax, partly because the higher order brain functions have decreased at that moment, but also because ejaculation is an involuntary, reflexive thing. It's not like you can think about baseball and cold showers and stop it from happening. Now, returning to the theological aspect here. There's no specific condemnation of masturbation in the New Testament, or in the writings of the Fathers of the Church. Some might ask, as indeed Father Harvey asks in his article, does that mean masturbation is all right, theologically speaking? Well, first we have to give some weight to the traditional interpretation. We are not biblical fundamentalists who need to have an explicit warrant for everything in the Bible, or else, nope, unchristian, throw it out. As I've said in some of our discussions on homosexuality, sure, Jesus doesn't have any explicit teachings on homosexuality, but neither does he have any teachings on securities fraud, speeding, or internet pornography. We can't expect absolutely everything to be found in the Bible. And not only that, we as Catholics believe the Bible is but one source of theological data, one means through which God mediates his revelation. We have to look also at the authoritative teaching office which he constituted when he founded his church. And quite consistently, Christian authors through the centuries have condemned masturbation. And that's not nothing. We might also adopt a more biblically based argument by saying there are ethical principles announced in other texts of the New Testament. I've already told you about unity and generativity, which we find in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, but also strong emphasis on self-control in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 7, verse 9, written by St. Paul. Father Harvey cites other texts from throughout the New Testament as well, the consistent emphasis of which is on the practice of restraint, on the avoidance of sexual immorality, and using well the gift of our sexuality. You may refer back to his article for specific citations. Okay. The teaching of Christian authors and authorities has been that masturbation is sinful, and sinful by reason of its object. Thinking back to the sources of morality framework that we learned about in the first unit, we can say this is an intrinsically evil act. Its object contradicts the purposes of human sexuality, forasmuch as it is both solipsistic and ungenerative. How many people does it take to masturbate? Just one. What's the connection between... Apologies for that interruption. Now, masturbation may be called intrinsically evil by reason of its object because it is solipsistic and ungenerative. That is to say, it requires no commitment, no engagement from a person. Do apologize for these interruptions. Look, the basic point is that masturbation doesn't require anything from a person. It doesn't require any sort of real encounter with somebody else, and as I was saying a moment ago, what commitment is required of a consumer of pornography? What obligations does he or she assume vis-a-vis the people who for that person are just a means of exciting sexual pleasure? It's also clear masturbation is ungenerative. It does not create the possibility of new life. And we might say, even where, factually speaking, a child results, as in cases of assisted reproductive technologies like in vitro fertilization, there might be some disorders in the way the couple are approaching procreation that make their act fundamentally ungenerative. Now, that's the objective side of the problem, but we also have to consider subjective morality and considerations such as the gravity of the matter, the degree of knowledge brought to the act, and the consent of the agent. In terms of gravity, I remind you of the principle of Claudius Aquaviva, which is a mainstay in Roman Catholic moral theology. In re sexuali non datur parvitas materiae, or sexual sins are always grave. They don't admit of greatness or lightness in degree. There's a contrast with theft. Look, theft becomes more serious depending on whether you're stealing 10 centimo, 10 peso, or 10 million peso. But masturbation's seriousness isn't determined by the number of strokes. We also have to talk about knowledge of the act's evil. Some people are ignorant of masturbation itself, for example, very small children or the insane. They don't know what they're doing, and consequently aren't culpable in an ordinary sense. We can also speak of those who are ignorant of masturbation's sinfulness. People from different cultural or religious backgrounds might not understand the assessment of this act given by the Roman Catholic Church, which the Church does state is accessible to natural reason. Sadly, we should also note that there are probably very many Christians and very many Catholics who regard masturbation as innocuous, harmless. All right. This represents a failure of catechesis. Now, assessing the ignorance of these people becomes difficult. I say that because even if they don't know that it's sinful, there's a certain natural hesitancy or bashfulness. These people may think, well, I don't sin by doing it, but at the same time they're not doing it openly or publicly, and they're not talking about it with their friends. We should hope. So there's that bashfulness which might suggest to them, this is wrong, I shouldn't be doing it. But then another part of them says, well, it couldn't possibly be that serious to God, or it couldn't possibly be wrong. What I'm saying is, sometimes people know at one level something isn't right, when at another level they try and convince themselves that it is. And this makes the assessment of culpability difficult. In case you were ignorant of masturbation sinfulness before this course, you're not now. No excuses. Then we have to consider the question of the consent the agent brings to the act. To quote Hamlet, there's the rub. See, the neuropsychology we talked about before can affect culpability mainly by working on the degree of consent that an agent brings to his or her behaviors. We can speak of different degrees of freedom in acting, right? Before, I may have given the example of a degenerate drug addict who's shooting up dope after 20 years of abusing mind-altering substances. And on the other hand, a person who's trying marijuana for the first time. The first-time user is not affected in his or her patterns of thinking and willing, to say nothing of at a biological level, by the influence of these mind-altering drugs. The degenerate addict, after 20 years, however, has a much lower degree of freedom in his or her activity. Okay? We can also pull in some distinctions between categorical and transcendental freedom. This is the subject of Timothy O'Connell's supplementary article on the theology of sin and the human person, wherein he talks about our so-called fundamental option. Now, O'Connell would have argued that masturbation is a categorical choice, to choose to do this one thing to the exclusion of other things, but that it doesn't necessarily determine us for or against absolute good. We've seen, however, critiques of O'Connell's position in Veritatis Splendor, where John Paul II posited a close connection between our concrete choices and our identity as one under the reign of God or under the reign of sin. I would also refer you back to William May's article on mortal sin and venial sin, where he develops this further. Through our choices to do this or that particular thing, we make statements about who we are and where we stand in relation to the good. And our sexual activity is one form of speaking about ourselves in this way. Okay. Well, there's greater degrees of freedom in isolated behaviors than in habitual ones because of the influence of conditioning upon our behaviors and choices. Repetition of a certain act can degrade our freedom in a way, at least where we're talking about vices. We can make a distinction, as Father Harvey does in his article, between habitual and compulsive masturbation. An habitual masturbator is one who has a relative degree of control over his or her masturbatory activity, whereas the compulsive masturbator has all but lost that control. I say all but because they're never completely deprived of their freedom, assuming that they are lucid and sui compos, to use the legal term. that is to say, responsible for themselves. When we talk about masturbation and subjective blameworthiness, we note it is a human act which engages our intellect and will. You don't slip on a banana peel and accidentally masturbate. This is something that you have to choose to do. So, masturbation is a human act. It's relatively more human where we're talking about an individual act which is not part of an overarching pattern of behavior. But where we speak about habitual masturbation, and with what greater reason when we speak about compulsive masturbation, we're talking about some diminution of our freedom. The pleasure which is associated with genital stimulation or stimulation of the erogenous zones causes certain physiological and chemical changes within the brain. And as a result of this, we are disposed to go back and to seek the type of pleasure resulting from those behaviors by performing those behaviors. As I said before, we're fighting against biology in a certain way if one is trying to get this habit of masturbation under control and to restore his or her freedom in terms of sexual activity. Okay? A word on pornography. It's typically used as a masturbatory aid. The male brain has a sort of a preference for image-based pornography. Women tend to prefer text-based pornography, which is why perhaps you see all of these romance novels with the shirtless sailors, etc. They can be just as smutty as the images men consume, only they use a lot of florid, fancy language that tickles the mind. If I were to speak about general societal attitudes toward pornography, I'd say it's regarded as innocuous, as harmless. That's the way a lot of people present it. That's not the position that we as Catholics hold, however. By its proliferation and its accessibility, it's become a real social scourge, something immoral and degrading in our estimation. We should begin by noting that it degrades the producers of the pornography. And when I say producers, I don't mean only those making the films and marketing them. I'm talking about the actors and those portrayed therein. What we're seeing is a commercialization of sexual intimacy between two people. What should be a noble, a worthy, and a beautiful thing becomes something that's bought or sold. And the people themselves become objects, things, simply used as a tool by other people. The consumers also are degraded by this objectification of other people. They are morally blameworthy for treating other people as mere tools for their pleasure, mere things to be used. And feminists are quite right when they point out that pornography facilitates sexism and violence against women. I'd already mentioned about duplicity and secrecy. I don't need to say anything further there. But it does weaken or undermine relationships. Again, see David French's article for more. I should say a word also on the subject of foreplay. I'll define it as deliberate stimulation of the genital organs as a prelude to normal conjugal relations. You'll note there's some similarity to the Catechism's definition of masturbation, as well as the statement of principle from Persona Humana. But I note the critical difference. This is not an alternative to or a substitute for normal conjugal relations. It's a prelude to it. Foreplay can serve sexual unitivity by making sex more pleasurable. Now, foreplay can make sex more pleasurable by assisting, for example, in achieving or maintaining an erection, where a man has some difficulty in doing this, let's say because of low blood pressure. I'd also note, foreplay can serve the purpose of sexual unitivity by increasing vaginal lubrication and reducing friction. Sex is a frictive activity. Heat is generated by the couple grinding together. This can cause abrasions, it can cause some tearing of tissues. The female body has a response to this by producing vaginal lubrication. It secretes mucus in order to reduce the amount of friction and the amount of heat, thus minimizing somewhat the amount of pain that results to both parties. And it's not just the vaginal tissues which can be abraded or damaged, it's also the shaft of the penis. Parenthetically, I might mention that there is a relatively lower degree of sexually transmitted diseases among lesbians than among heterosexual couples or among homosexual male couples. Now, some of the reason for this is the mode of sexual intercourse. In lesbian intercourse, there's not a lot of grinding or abrasion. In heterosexual intercourse, there's some, but that's mitigated by the naturally produced vaginal lubrication. In male homosexual intercourse, there's relatively more friction or more tension because the preferred mode of intercourse is anal sex, and the anus does not produce any lubrication. Where there's more tearing, there's more likelihood for the mingling of blood and other bodily fluids, which can carry the viruses or bacteria responsible for sexually transmitted diseases. Okay? Foreplay can also serve the purpose of sexual generativity by assisting couples in the completion of sex. If, for example, the man has difficulty achieving or maintaining an erection, it's less likely that conception will occur, for as much as it's less likely that the man will achieve climax. We can deal with the practical question, what if one partner finishes first? Yes, this is something theological authors have considered. You might look at books by the author Christopher West. He considers what should be done if the woman climaxes before the male. Simply, the man should complete the sexual act in order that the generative purpose of sexuality be fulfilled. If it is the man who climaxes before the woman, however, it's not necessary to continue that sexual act, though good form, etiquette, and considerateness for one's wife would suggest finishing the act, even though the generative purpose has been functionally fulfilled. That is to say, unitivity can be a reason for bringing the woman to climax after the generative purpose has been fulfilled through completed orgasm by the male. If there should occur a premature extravaginal ejaculation, let's note, this is not a human act unless it is directly intended and achieved. If it happens spontaneously because of the normal operation of human sexual physiology, it's not morally blameworthy. This would constitute an act of man rather than a human act. An evil merely in the physical, non-moral order, rather than in the moral or spiritual order. A brief word also on masturbation and artificial reproductive techniques, and we'll conclude with this. There's a terminological and conceptual distinction between AI and IVF. Both, however, involve some kind of mechanical or technical assistance in achieving insemination. For in vitro fertilization, semen is ordinarily collected via masturbation. However, there are other techniques, for example, involving the extraction of semen by means of a hypodermic needle. Most of the time, though, it is, as I say, extracted via masturbation unless there's some very serious physiological problem with the man preventing that ordinary means. Let's say, for example, a very, very low sperm count. Now, another problem with in vitro fertilization is not the masturbatory aspect of it, but it's also the selective abortion or sequestration of other suboptimal embryos. And there's a moral conundrum of what to do with these sequestered embryos. Should they be fertilized, implanted, and brought to conception? Should they be destroyed? If you destroy a fertilized embryo, that constitutes an act of abortion. But if you implant it in a mother, there we see some technological distortion of the basic purposes of our sexuality. It's basically got no good solution to the problem, and the verdict is still out by theologians what concrete steps could be taken in that case. I have mentioned a little bit in classes about how artificial reproductive technologies disregard the purposes of virtuous sexuality. They compromise the unitive aspect because, well, it's not necessary that the parties be husband and wife, or even that they be acquainted with each other, or given advances in modern cryonic technology, that they even both be alive. Unitivity can be completely annihilated using artificial reproductive technologies. Likewise, the generative aspect is attacked inasmuch as the biological parent is in many cases superfluous. Their presence is not necessary, and this is evidenced, for example, in the practice of sperm donation through anonymous sperm banks. The father of that child becomes merely a source of genetic material and has no involvement in that child's upbringing or raising. Likewise, there can be the view that children are an entitlement to which one has a right. In this view, children are not gifts generally to be accepted and loved. They're things to be bought by consulting relevant technical experts. This leads to a generally transactional attitude toward the creation of new life, which is unfitting with human dignity. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I do thank you for your time and attention, and I hope to see you on the class meeting for the second unit test following our Easter break. Good day.